Well, good morning and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberaj, a managing director at Savills, a leading tenant advisory global commercial real estate firm. In the news today, Justice Clarence Thomas has been in the hospital since Friday with an infection, and Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson begins her confirmation hearings as the president's nominee to the United States Supreme Court. Today's topic is the future of the Supreme Court. We're joined by Brian Fallon, the executive director of Demand Justice. Brian, good to see you.
Ken, cheers. Good morning.
Cheers. This is long in the making. I told you we'd have you on if Justice Breyer ever retired. You didn't think that was ever going to happen, but here we are.
We always hoped.
So tell us, what's the significance of today? You started Demand Justice a few years ago. How big is this moment in time for you and the organization?
So this is a historic day for the Biden administration and really for the whole country. In the first time in 233-year history of the Supreme Court, we have a Black woman nominated for the Supreme Court. And we have, for the first time ever, a public defender nominated for the Supreme Court. President Biden, of course, famously made the commitment during the campaign that he would nominate the first Black woman. And so we were expecting that, and we've been looking forward to that for a long time. But for those of us that have been trying to change the conversation in the Democratic Party about the types of people that we nominate to serve as judges, it's a historic moment in that sense, too, because we have somebody here who's the first person really with criminal defense experience since Thurgood Marshall, and the first person ever in Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is a former public defender. Usually in the Democratic Party, the standard has been to nominate corporate attorneys and prosecutors. Mm-hmm. And for the first time in the last year under President Biden, we've seen in his judicial nominations a real commitment to public defenders, civil rights lawyers, legal aid lawyers, labor lawyers, really changing the face of the federal judiciary, we think for the better, because we think that more diversity and more perspectives on the law make the system fairer. So we've got a great group of Black law students from historically Black colleges and universities gathered here in Washington, D.C., as well as a great delegation from the Black Public Defenders Association, people who see themselves in Ketanji Brown Jackson and people who are really thrilled about this historic first that she represents.
Well, it's an exciting time. She's getting a lot of positive attention. What happens today? This is the first day of hearings. Map out the next week, 2 weeks. What do you expect? What should people keep an eye out for?
Yeah, so this will be a relatively quick process, in part because she's been confirmed successfully by the Senate 3 times before, including as recently as last year for the post that she currently holds. She's currently a judge on the D.C. Circuit, which is considered the second most powerful court in the country, just below
which is the other thing in her resume, which is incredible.
Yep.
Having been a judge, longest serving judge, probably.
And she's got trial court experience as well as appellate court experience. She'll be only the second justice on the court, if confirmed, to have that accolade, with Sonia Sotomayor being the other. So we're going to have the first day of hearings today. Today will be relatively sleepy. The first day of hearings mostly consists of senators bloviating. Each senator is allowed.
Washington, right?
There's 22 senators on the Judiciary Committee. Each of them gets a 10-minute opening statement, and she just has to sit there and listen to all the senators give their perspective on her. And so we'll mostly hear from senators today. We will only hear from her at the very end of today's session. She'll give a brief opening statement, and then they will adjourn for the day, come back tomorrow, and that's when the questions will begin. And so she'll be facing questions tomorrow and Wednesday, and the process will wrap up by Thursday. We expect the committee will vote on her probably next week, and we think that the full Senate will vote on her probably before the Easter recess in mid-April.
Interesting. So as a public defender in her past, it seems in the news now that it's generating a lot of interest from the committee about lines of questioning that maybe wouldn't have come up with previous nominees. So talk a little bit about that. Like, what do you think the tough questions might be? What do you think she may get attacked on or, have critical questions about?
Well, I've been talking about her public defender background as a real credential in her favor, and I do think that is a big reason that President Biden, who himself was a former public defender for a brief time before he was a senator, I think that's a big reason that he selected her. But we expect to see some members of the committee demagogue that service. She was only in that role for a couple of years, and in that role, represented people that couldn't afford a lawyer. But she worked as a federal public defender, and so part of her work was to defend Gitmo detainees. Yeah. And so I would expect that there'll be some senators that try to cast aspersions on that, what I think is a public service, try to suggest that she's soft on terrorism or soft on crime because of the defendants that she represented. When you're a public defender, you don't get to pick your clients. It really is a public service. You get a government salary. She clerked on the Supreme Court. She was a clerk for Justice Breyer, who's retiring, whose seat she's going to fill. And there's very few Supreme Court clerks that go on to be public defenders. When you're a Supreme Court clerk, You command huge bonuses from private sector firms. So it's really unusual for her to have selected to go into a public defender type role. So to us, that's extremely honorable. I think you're going to hear Dick Durbin, the chairman of the committee, really praise her for her service as a public defender. Certainly the White House has. But I do think there'll be some people that try to score political points by trying to act like she's soft on crime or that she countenances some of the criminal activity of some of the people that she was assigned to represent as a public defender.
Well, it's interesting. I want to hear a little bit more about like the path one traditionally took to even being a nominee to the court, right? Because at that time when she left working for Breyer, she could have easily gone corporate and maybe been on a more traditional path to a nomination, but then instead took this path, which now, moment in time, is something that the president cares more about, the public seems to care more about. So what is the normal path people take? How is that being disrupted and changed? How do you think future presidents should be looking at not only the Supreme Court, but courts around the country for nominees?
Well, coming into the Biden administration, if you looked at all the people that serve as federal judges in this country, prosecutors outnumbered criminal defense lawyers by a ratio of about 4 to 1. And that just makes for a very unbalanced approach to the law. You want people that have worked on behalf of the little person, people that have not just represented corporations, but people that have represented workers. You want people that have not just represented the government in prosecuting cases. You want people that have worked on the other side of that and represented real people and understand the plight of criminal defendants that are experiencing the system from that vantage point. Because in combination, it gives the federal bench more of a holistic perspective, and you tend to get justice better served that way. But we've seen things completely out of whack because it hasn't been just Republican presidents, but also Democratic presidents that have defaulted to choosing people from two particular lanes of the profession. People that have served as partners at big corporate firms or people that have worked as government prosecutors, traditionally as assistant U.S. attorneys. And even still now, Biden has appointed his share of assistant U.S. attorneys, prosecutor types, and corporate lawyers as well. But you're seeing way more of a resolve and a commitment shown by this White House to diversifying the federal bench. And so 60+% of the people that he's nominated in his first year have been people that came from civil rights or public defenders type backgrounds. So that's been a very welcome shift. And I think it's one that is going to remain. I think he's sort of moving the paradigm for Democratic presidents, and whoever his successor is will probably take a similar approach. There's some, it takes a while for the machinery of this election process to adapt. There's a lot of big role that senators have in the process. For district level judgeships, individual senators frequently have a lot of say. They make recommendations to the White House about who they'd like to see the president pick. And so the White House is typically deferential to senators. So a lot of our pressure has actually been focused on individual senators. If a judgeship comes open in New Jersey or New York or Illinois, we go directly to Dick Durbin, we go directly to Chuck Schumer, we go directly to Senator Booker, and we ask them to recommend, professionally diverse people, because we know that the White House will largely defer to what those senators say. And those senators all tend to have vetting committees. They put together like blue ribbon panels, if you will, of very well-regarded lawyers in their home state. And those lawyers are sort of the first line of vetting that makes suggestions to the senator about who to recommend to the White House. And what we've found in our last couple of years of advocating on this issue is that the reason that you get so few lawyers recommended for judgeships that come from public defender backgrounds or civil rights lawyer backgrounds is because none of those types of lawyers are on the selection committees. So the senatorial selection committees tend to largely consist of corporate lawyers and prosecutors. And so who do they choose? They choose the people, their colleagues that they work with every day, people that they have firsthand knowledge of. And that makes it harder for people like with Ketanji Brown Jackson's type of resume to get noticed by those selection committees. So we've been working with individual Senate offices to get them to change the composition of their selection committees to diversify those. That we think will start to lead to more diverse, professionally diverse nominees in the long run.
So you seem to be filling a lane that's a bit disruptive potentially, but filling a void in the process of building a stronger pipeline and broadening who gets nominated to various seats. Taking a step back, we have 3 branches of government in this country. There's a lot of focus on the executive branch and the legislative branch as it relates to momentum and engagement from the public. Today, you're going to have hundreds of students from around the country here. I mean, how do you bring more of this kind of strategic thinking about engagement, and why aren't more people paying attention or care more about lower level judgeships and that impact? I mean, what are you trying to shift and change in terms of thinking of average Americans, how they look at this branch of government?
We're trying to provoke 2 changes. One is with law students. We want law students a lot of law students go into law school with very idealistic ambitions about what they want to do after law school. And then law school sort of sucks that idealism out of them. And a lot of them are told, like, hey, if you want to have a politically viable career, if you want to be in line for an appointment at some point down the line, you need to go into only one or two lanes of the profession to be viable politically. And we want to change that sort of notion or that bias. We want to convince people that there's prestige with these types of lanes of the profession, like public defender, like civil rights lawyer. And we want to show that actually Democrats are starting to prioritize those types of backgrounds. And so it's an extremely viable, if not preferable, lane of the profession to go down if you do want to explore a judicial appointment opportunity in the future. So that's one audience that we're trying to speak to. And then we're trying to speak more generally to the public at large. That is, the matters of the judiciary and the activities of the judiciary are largely opaque to most people. And the other side, the Republicans, have benefited from that, the judiciary sort of operating at a significant remove from the public's understanding. And we'd like to demystify the court. We'd like to demystify who serves on the bench. We like the fact that Ketanji Brown Jackson as a person, as a human being, is resonating, and that people know who she is and are excited about her. We think that the more that the public is informed about who's serving as judges, the better engaged we'll be as a civic society, and that's all to the good. I think that we're about to experience a period in the next few years where the Supreme Court's going to be handing down rulings that will really, shock the public in terms of how political some of the decisions will be. You have a term, this year where they're going to rule in June on issues from abortion to guns to climate change. And I expect that some of the rulings will be out of step with mainstream public opinion. And I think it'll take a lot of people aback and take a lot of people by surprise. And we want to have the public sort of be engaged in that discussion, understand why it is that those types of rulings are coming down, understand how we came to have a court that is 6-3 in a very conservative direction. And so I think that this confirmation process with a figure as engaging as Ketanji Brown Jackson might help draw more public attention to the issue of the courts generally. And I think that we'll all be better off for that.
So Judge Jackson is nominated to replace Stephen Breyer, who wrote a book called The Authority of the Court and the Peril of Politics, where he point blank kind of calls into question the notion and perception of political influence in the court. Talk a little bit about that and what he brought up and what the reality you're seeing on the ground is.
Justice Breyer is very old school. So Justice Breyer came of age politically in the 1970s. He served in the Senate. He was an aide to Ted Kennedy back then, and then was appointed to the appellate court by Jimmy Carter, and then nominated, obviously, to the Supreme Court by Bill Clinton in the early 90s. And I think that his time in the Senate was one where you could still do deals across the aisle. Ted Kennedy was famous for being able to cut deals with Orrin Hatch and John McCain on issues ranging from children's health insurance to immigration, and that era is just gone. I think that volume that Justice Breyer published this fall is sort of belied the narrative that he gives of the court and how depoliticized it is as an institution. I think that it's a very idealistic view of the court and its role in our politics today, but I don't think it's one that matches with the reality. And I think that, one of our sort of premises is that progressives and elected Democrats need to sort of snap to attention and realize that while we've been treating the courts in a very hands-off way, there's been a concerted project for 40 years being conducted by the other side to really capture the court and bend it towards a far right agenda. And I think that the most recent term, these last few months have sort of shown that Stephen Breyer's account of the court as sort of beyond the reach of politics is not really true anymore. And, he would know at this point the court has voted on how it's going to rule in these cases, unlike this Mississippi abortion ban after 15 weeks. We won't hear the decision announcement probably until June, but the justices know they've already taken their votes and assigned the opinion. So he knows what decisions are going to come out in June. Some people have speculated that may have dispirited him to the point where he decided to finally retire and make an announcement relatively early in the calendar year compared to past precedent. He announced in January, which was a little ahead of schedule compared to when most people typically announce their retirements.
Well, when you step into something like this, where you are arguably a little disruptive in a system that's existed in an opaque way, you tend to get attention, right? So how often should people expect to hear demand justice or Brian Fallon literally mentioned in a confirmation hearing for a Supreme Court nominee And how do you think that either helps or hurts this nomination and future nominations?
So we've been very outspoken about our support for Justice Jackson, soon to be Justice Jackson, now Judge Jackson. We put out a short list 3 years ago, suggesting names to then candidate Biden for people that we'd love to see him nominate to the Supreme Court. Ketanji Brown Jackson was on that list. When she was nominated for the Circuit Court last year, we engaged in a bunch of activities to support her nomination then. We've been organizing a lot of activities now. And Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, have sought to use that against her. They have very little in her record to attack her for. And so one of their main lanes of criticism has been a sort of guilt by association critique of her, saying, well, why do progressive groups like Demand Justice support you so strongly? And so I would expect, we've seen a bunch of Biden nominees go through their hearings and be asked about whether they've met with us, why do they think that we support them? And, we've been very clear about why we support them, because they're professionally diverse people that come from underrepresented corners of the profession. Ketanji Brown Jackson, we supported her because of her background as a public defender. So I don't know that there's much there. I think that the main reason that they're doing it is it's sort of a light touch way for them to oppose Judge Jackson. Most of these Republicans, Mitch McConnell included, cannot be caught voting for Joe Biden's nominee. But the optics of them viscerally, vocally opposing the first African-American woman from the Supreme Court doesn't sit right. So I think they're sort of trying to do a little bit of a bank shot line of attack on her that features us. And so if that means that, we take the bullets for the next few days and route to confirmation for her, that's fine.
Interesting. Talk more broadly about efforts and goals on your part for court reform in general. I think you've been pretty vocal about the public and our democracy in general just needing to take a step back and looking at some of the politicization of the court and maybe more seats, term limits, et cetera. What's your macro view on the Supreme Court, courts in general across the country, and what structurally needs to be done?
Yeah, so I think that the court has been the subject of a concerted project that has been waged for the last 40 years by groups like the Federalist Society. And I don't say that with anything other than respect for their single-minded focus and commitments to getting their people appointed to the bench. But I think that now that they have their people installed, Trump appointed over 200 judges, including 3 Supreme Court justices. I think that the public is going to be sort of taken for a loop by the types of rulings that are going to be coming out and the longstanding precedents that are going to be overturned in sort of a willy-nilly manner. And I think people are going to be sort of get whiplash from the rulings that are likely coming down the pike in the next 2 to 3 years. And so I think we're going to see consensus start to form, not just among Democrats, but among independents too, that are taking longstanding precedents like Roe for granted. When this court puts those types of longstanding precedents into question in the coming years, I think a consensus will emerge that something more structurally needs to be done to depoliticize the court. Obviously, we're not going to have any cooperation from Republicans in trying to depoliticize the court because they're happy with the court in its current state. They worked for many years to get it to this point where they have a 6-3 advantage on the court. But I think that ultimately we're going to need both sides to have sort of a truce.
Yeah.
And we're going to need both sides to say, hey, why not? It's crazy. Like Clarence Thomas, for instance, you mentioned at the beginning, is ill right now. It looks like he's going to be fine. But the world sort of stops whenever there's a health status update about a Supreme Court justice, because the process is all dependent on a justice getting sick or having an untimely death, and the political world sort of stops. Yeah. Wouldn't it be way more rational if we just had sort of fixed tenures for these Supreme Court justices and we had sort of a balanced way of replacing them, so that there wasn't so much gamesmanship in terms of people timing their retirements based on who the president is, or based on having people start World War III politically because somebody, that Republican appointed justice dies under a Democratic president, like happened with Antonin Scalia. Yeah. You saw such drastic measures taken as Mitch McConnell refusing to even vote on Merrick Garland. If we could sort of take some of that all or nothing sense of peril out of each confirmation process, that would be a healthy thing for our democracy. Right now, the elected branches of government have sort of been stymied. They're dysfunctional. And as a result, most of the policy making happening today in America is coming out of the courts. And that's not what the founders intended. We ought to restore the balance of power so that decisions are being made by the elected branches and decisions are not being punted to the judiciary. And so I think both sides have a long-term interest in arriving at that type of situation and achieving more of an equilibrium. But again, Republicans are going to be less interested in that because they like the way things are. So that leaves it to us to sort of build consensus and motivate the public to sort of understand what's going on and look at things like term limits, look at things like adding seats to the court.
So we mentioned a new era beyond what Justice Breyer grew up in, with misinformation and 24-hour news cycle. I mean, how optimistic are you that we could ever get there? I mean, it just seems like every day that passes, we get further and further apart from this kind of coherent conversation that we could and should be having. I mean, how challenging is this going to be?
It's going to be very challenging, but I think that we ought to be able to achieve a consensus in favor of not having unelected justices serving life tenure, making all the decisions. So even if you come at it from a conservative or progressive standpoint, the idea that we're sort of surrendering all the decision-making to these unelected judges, that should be an area of consensus. It's not going to be for the time being because, like I said, Republican lawmakers are happy to have the court with its current 6-3 tilts make all the decisions. But the rest of us ought not allow that. And I think that the looming decisions that are coming are going to create a consensus, some kind of will to act. It's not going to come naturally to Democratic elected officials because for so many years we were taught that the courts ultimately do the right thing. Most people grew up learning about the Warren Court era and learning about, Brown versus Board of Education. It was really a historical anomaly. It's more of the exception rather than the rule in terms of the court's history. The court's history is a pretty backward one. It's pretty firmly on the side against civil rights and against big breakthroughs for equality. But a lot of us still remember that heyday of the 50s and 60s. That era is long gone now. And in many ways, that sort of triggered the pendulum to swing back. The capstone of the 6-3 court that Republicans have captured now has really been a rejoinder to that Warren Court era that they really strongly dislike. Now I think the pendulum's going to have to start to swing back in the other way, and the public's going to have to become engaged in that if anything's going to happen.
Yeah. So do you expect her to get pressed during these hearings about recusing herself for certain cases coming up?
Yes.
How do you think that this gets played out over the next kind of
So we mentioned this term, the court is deciding cases on abortion, on guns, on climate change. Next term, they're likely to hear a case involving a challenge to affirmative action policies in college admissions. And specifically, Harvard University is one of the defendants in that case. And Judge Jackson is a member of the one of the governing boards of Harvard University. So there's been some calls from certain Republicans that she should commit to recusing herself during the confirmation hearings. This strikes me similar to the criticisms about her support from outside groups. This is another bank shot style criticism of her. This is not a type of line of criticism that is going to endanger her nomination. It's just sort of a ticky-tack line of questioning that she'll probably come up with. I'll be surprised if she makes any commitments in this hearing to recusing from any cases that she might hear. She'll probably say that that's undue speculation for her to decide that now. And really, I think a lot of the senators that might be trying to press her on that will not have much of a leg to stand on. There's a lot more coverage recently of ethics questions regarding Justice Thomas and his wife's involvement with various groups related to the January 6th insurrection. A lot of calls for recusal for Justice Thomas on that have gone unheeded. And so if people want to start to have a debate about justices having to recuse from cases, that's a trickier conversation that most Republican senators probably aren't going to want to have.
Well, look, we have a hearing coming up pretty soon. You got all these young people filing in. They were outside welcoming Judge Jackson as she was coming in for hearings. What do you hope they take out of this trip to Washington when they go back to their universities and law schools and share with their friends what they saw? Like, what do you hope they take away from this experience?
Well, we have two great groups here. We have groups of law students and groups of public defenders. And we had a great welcome dinner for these folks last night. And Judge Richard Boulware, who's a former public defender, who's now a federal judge in Nevada, was our keynote speaker. And
you couldn't find a closer public defender that was a judge?
Unfortunately, there's not enough public defenders on the bench, but Richard Boulware is one of the great ones. And he was put on the bench by Obama and the late Harry Reid from Nevada. And he really said, this is a moment for public defenders. This is a moment where we need to have a more balanced composition of the federal judiciary. And public defenders are in the trenches. They sort of know the situation of their clients. And he gave some vivid examples of just little rules in our federal court system that tend to side against people that don't have means.
Yeah.
And it's really public defenders and people that are on the front lines representing real people that sort of understand that, bring that knowledge to the role of being a judge. And so I think that this has been a very galvanizing moment for the public defender community. They're seeing themselves in Ketanji Brown Jackson, to say nothing of, obviously Black law students and young Black lawyers who see themselves in Ketanji Brown Jackson. This is a milestone that's way overdue. The first Black woman.
Well, exciting. Well, look, thanks for letting us crash the party today.
Thanks for coming.
It's good to be here. Thank you to everybody
for
the coffee. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Our next Coffee with Ken will be this Thursday with Ilir Sela, who's the founder of Slice, a pizza serving app. Until then, you can watch past sessions on Pizza and Coffee. CoffeeWithKen.com. Until then, have a great one. Thanks for tuning in.